The world doesn't just run on money, it runs on power. Richard Sterling thought he had both. He was a self-made millionaire, and he'd just traded in his quiet, elegant wife Elara for a superstar model. He was on top of the world, flaunting his new life in the $80 million oceanfront mansion he'd built as his monument. But Richard made one fatal mistake. He thought his wife's family was just old news. He forgot that while millionaires build houses, dynasties build empires, and they can tear them down just as easily. The Southampton air was different. It wasn't just clean, salt-tinged air. It was, as Richard Sterling liked to say, filtered by wealth. And his new home, a towering structure of glass, white marble, and reclaimed Brazilian teak, was the filter. He called it the Sterling Point, a 15,000-square-foot behemoth that jutted out over the dunes, defying the very ocean it overlooked. It was a house built not for comfort, but for page 6. Tonight it was performing its function perfectly. The terrace was packed with a curated slice of New York's elite. Tech billionaires clinked glasses with fashion editors. A U.S. senator was laughing too loudly by the infinity pool. And at the center of it all, holding court, was Richard. "It's not just a house," he was booming his voice, a practiced baritone that carried over the lounge music. He wore a custom Brioni suit, unbuttoned, no tie. "It's a statement. You don't buy a view like this. You earn it." His wife Elara stood near the edge of the terrace, holding a glass of Sancerre she hadn't sipped. She was watching him, not with the adoration he craved, but with the quiet, anthropological curiosity she usually reserved for the 17th century Dutch paintings she curated. Elara was a Vance. The Vances didn't make statements. They were the statement. They owned the banks that held the loans for the buildings that men like Richard built. They owned the land under the museums. They were a dynasty, and Elara was their quiet, almost forgotten scion. She wore a simple sleeveless navy dress by the row. Her only jewelry was a thin platinum watch, her grandmother's. She was, as Richard often complained, aggressively understated. "He's impressive, your husband." A voice slid in next to her. Elara turned. It was Isabella Monet. The Isabella Monet. The 22-year-old face of Gucci Prada and 1,000 magazine covers. She was 6 feet tall before heels poured into a metallic gold dress that seemed sprayed onto her skin. She was an event, a spectacle. "Richard is driven," Elara replied, her voice soft. "Driven. He's a hurricane." Isabella laughed, her eyes scanning the crowd. "He wants everyone to look at him. And you just want to disappear, don't you?" Elara felt a cold prickle. "I'm not here to be looked at. I'm here to support Richard." "That's sweet." Isabella's smile was a perfect white carnivorous thing. "But honey, in this world, if you're not being looked at, you're invisible. And if you're invisible..." She let the sentence hang, taking a long, slow drag from a forbidden cigarette. Her eyes weren't on Elara. They were on Richard, who had just spotted her. He broke off his conversation mid-sentence, his politician's smile shifting into something more primal. He began to move through the crowd toward them, a shark sensing blood. "Elara, darling," he said, arriving and placing a possessive hand on the small of her back. But his eyes devoured Isabella. "I see you've met the guest of honor. Isabella, you made it." "Richard, what a house," Isabella purred, touching his lapel. "It's so big." "I build things to last," he said, his chest puffing out. "Do you?" Isabella's gaze flicked to Elara, then back to Richard. Elara watched the exchange. It was so blatant, so lacking in subtlety, that it was almost boring. This was not the discreet old-world infidelity she'd been raised to expect. This was a hostile takeover. "Richard," Elara said, her voice cutting through their little bubble. "Mrs. Vanderbilt is leaving. You need to say goodbye." Richard's face tightened. He hated being reminded of social niceties. He hated for a split second that Elara was better at this than he was. "Right, of course." He nodded curtly at Isabella. "Don't go far." As he walked away, Isabella turned to Elara. "He's amazing. A real man. Not like those bony boys from your world, the ones who look like they've never seen the sun." "My world?" Elara asked. "Oh, come on." "The Vances, the Dynasty," Isabella said with a mock reverent tone. "All that dusty old money, all those rules. Don't you ever just want to scream, buy something tacky, live a little?" "My family values privacy," Elara said, finally, taking a sip of her wine. "Privacy is just a word for people who are afraid to be famous," Isabella replied. "Richard isn't afraid. He's building an empire. I'm just here to be his empress." The words hung in the air. His empress. Not an empress. Elara looked at the 22-year-old, a girl who had mistaken fame for power and attention for respect. Then she looked at her husband, a man who had mistaken his millions for her family's billions. "Well," Elara said, setting her glass down, "the job is open." She walked away, leaving Isabella momentarily speechless. Elara moved through the party, a ghost in navy blue, navigating the groups of people who were all there to worship at the altar of Richard Sterling. She knew with a certainty that settled like a stone in her stomach that her marriage was over. Richard hadn't just built a house. He had built a monument to his own ego, and she knew better than anyone that monuments could be torn down. The party was a grotesque success. It was written up in Vogue Tatler, and most importantly, to Richard Forbes. The headline was, "The New King of the Hamptons, Richard Sterling's $80 million statement." 2 weeks later, the smell of victory and Isabella's Frederick Malle perfume was still clinging to the curtains in the master bedroom when Richard finally delivered the blow. He didn't do it with shame. He did it with pride. "Elara, we need to talk," he said, straightening the knot of his Hermes tie in the reflection of the floor-to-ceiling glass wall that overlooked the Atlantic. It was 7 a.m. He was already dressed for war. Elara was in the adjoining dressing room, a massive custom-built space he'd designed lining up her shoes. She preferred her simple Repetto flats. He had tried and failed to get her into Christian Louboutin stilettos. "Are we?" she asked, not looking at him. She placed a pair of beige flats into their slot. "I'm not happy. I haven't been happy for a long time," he announced, as if reading from a script. "You're a wonderful woman, Elara. Your class, your elegance. But I'm not that man anymore. I'm not quiet." "I've never known you to be quiet, Richard," she said, her voice dry. He ignored her. "I'm a builder. I'm a creator. I need passion. I need fire. I need someone who sees me, not just my bank account." This was the line that finally made her stop and turn. The absurdity of it was breathtaking. She, Elara Vance, whose family trust fund could buy and sell sterling properties 10 times over without noticing the transaction fee, was being accused of being a gold digger. "And you found that fire?" she asked. Yes, with Isabella. He said her name with a flourish. She's alive. She understands the drive. She wants to build this empire with me. I see. Elara walked past him and sat on the edge of the bed, a vast, custom-made platform that Richard had boasted was earthquake-proof. She looked small against its imported suede headboard. "So I'm leaving you," he said. "I'm in love with her, and she's in love with me." "And the house?" Elara asked, her gaze drifting to the ocean. Richard's face hardened. This was the part he had rehearsed. This was the negotiation. "The house is mine, Elara. I designed it. I built it. My name is on the company that holds the deed. It's a non-marital asset. My lawyers have been very clear on that." "I'm not talking about the deed, Richard. I'm talking about the statement." "It's my statement," he snapped, his insecurity flaring. "And I'm not going to be bled dry by you. I know how this works. You with your quiet, judgmental family. You'll try to take half. Well, it's not happening." He began to pace, his adrenaline pumping. "I'll be generous, of course. I'm not a monster. I'll let you keep the apartment in the city." Elara had to suppress a laugh. The apartment was a 10-room pre-war masterpiece on Park Avenue that had been in her family since 1926. It was currently loaned to the French consulate. The apartment she lived in with Richard was a penthouse in Tribeca, also his. "Richard," she said, standing up, "I want nothing from you." He stopped pacing. "What?" "I said I want nothing. Not your apartment. Not your art, which is frankly terrible. And certainly not this." She gestured around the cavernous, cold bedroom. "I want my clothes, my books, and my grandmother's desk. That's all." Richard was thrown. This wasn't in the script. He was prepared for a fight, for tears, for screaming. He was not prepared for indifference. It enraged him. You can't be serious," he stammered. "What will you do? Where will you go? Run back to your dusty old uncle? My dusty old uncle, as you call him, is Julian Vance. And yes, I'll be staying at the family home on 72nd Street until my own place is prepared." "Your own place? What place I've been paying for your life for 10 years. "Elara," he shouted. This was his truth, the one he had constructed. He, the self-made man, had rescued her from a boring life of inherited privilege. Elara finally looked at him, and for the first time, Richard saw the Vance in her eyes. It wasn't fire, it was ice. "Richard, do you have any idea who I am?" she asked, her voice dangerously quiet. "You married a Vance. You were so blinded by the prestige of the name that you never once bothered to look at the ledger. You think you have money, you have debt, you have leverage, you have a brand built on perception. My family, we have assets. We don't build houses on sand, Richard. We own the sand." He was stunned into silence. "You've been, what, tolerating me?" He whispered the insult, landing like a physical blow. "I've been amused by you," she corrected. "But the amusement has worn off. You've become a cliché, a middle-aged man leaving his wife for a model. It's so boring." She walked back into the dressing room. He heard the metallic snick of suitcase latches. "You can't talk to me like that," he roared, following her. "I am Richard Sterling. I built this." "You did?" She agreed, placing a stack of folded cashmere sweaters into a Goyard trunk. "And you will be left with it." I'll ruin you," he threatened, but it sounded weak, childish. "I'll tell page 6 you're a cold, frigid snob. You'll tell page 6 whatever your new publicist, the one Isabella recommends, tells you to say. It will be a conscious uncoupling, and you will spin it as you being incredibly generous to your estranged wife. I know the game, Richard. Frankly, I'm relieved I no longer have to play." She zipped the trunk. A car, a discreet black Mercedes S-Class, that was not one of Richard's fleet of Rolls-Royces, was already crunching up the gravel driveway. "You'll regret this, Ilara," he said, his voice cracking. She paused at the door, her trunks already being handled by a driver who looked more like a security agent. "No, Richard, you will." She walked out of the $80 million mansion without a single look back. Richard Sterling stood alone in his glass cathedral, the silence of the house suddenly deafening. He had his mansion, his model, and his empire. He had never felt so small. The divorce proceedings were surgically fast. Just as Ilara had predicted, Richard's team, led by the infamously theatrical divorce lawyer Marty the Shark Klein, was prepared for a war of attrition. Marty, a man who wore diamond pinky rings and snakeskin boots, swaggered into the first and only meeting. Ilara was represented by Mr. Harrison, a man in his late 70s who wore a perpetually disappointed expression and a suit that was probably older than Marty. Harrison's firm had handled the Vance family's affairs since the Roosevelt administration. "Look, Harrison," Marty began, tossing a Mont Blanc pen on the table. "Richard is a very generous man. He's willing to offer, let's call it, a golden parachute. A lump sum, say $5 million. Plus she keeps her baubles. In exchange a full NDA, and she waives all future claims to Sterling properties, marital or otherwise." Mr. Harrison slowly put on his reading glasses. He looked at the paper Marty had slid across the table as if it were something unpleasant he'd found on his shoe. "Mr. Klein," Harrison said, his voice a dry rustle. "My client, Ms. Vance." "Mrs. Sterling," Marty corrected. "Ms. Vance," Harrison repeated with a flicker of steel, "has no interest in Mr. Sterling's generosity. She has, in fact, prepared her own terms." He slid a single sheet of vellum paper across the table. Marty scanned it, his cigar-chomping bravado faltering. He read it again. This is it," he stammered. "A list of furniture, a desk and 12 paintings. She wants no alimony, no stake in the company, no cash settlement. Ms. Vance is not in need of a settlement, Mr. Klein. She simply wants her personal property, which I might add was on loan to the marital home. The paintings are from her private collection. The desk belonged to her great-grandmother." Marty, for the first time in his career, was speechless. He'd come expecting to battle over hedge funds, offshore accounts, and the Southampton property. Instead, he was negotiating over a piece of antique furniture. "But the house," Marty said, recovering. "Richard built it, but she lived there. Community property, we could argue." "You could," Harrison interrupted. "And you would lose. The asset is held by Sterling Point, LLC, a Delaware corporation of which Mr. Sterling is the sole managing partner. It was never co-mingled. My client has no interest in it. She finds the property, and I quote, ostentatiously drafty." Marty was defeated. It was the easiest multi-million-dollar divorce of his life, and it felt like a total loss. He had no leverage. He couldn't even threaten them. "Fine," Marty snapped. "We'll sign." The story hit page 6 48 hours later. Sterling's solo act. Richard Sterling and Ilara Vance split. Sources say The property mogul was incredibly generous as model Isabella Monet moves in. Richard hated that they used her maiden name. He and Isabella were photographed a week later, kissing on a yacht in St. Bart's. Isabella had moved into the Sterling Point and immediately begun her reign. Her first act was to hire a new, trendy interior designer. "This place is so cold," she complained, running her hand over the minimalist Italian marble. "It needs life. It needs me." Elara's muted museum-quality neutrals were ripped out. Walls were painted a glittering, textured gold. Animal print rugs were thrown over the white oak floors. A 20-foot-tall portrait of Isabella nude and draped in vulgari snakes was commissioned for the main atrium. Richard, high on the fumes of his new life, approved every expense. The redecoration cost $3 million. The parties were constant. Dom Perignon flowed not by the bottle in their circles, but by the case. Isabella's friends, a flock of influencers, models, and DJs, descended on the house every weekend, documenting every vulgar detail for their millions of followers. "See," Richard would say to his own reflection, his pupils slightly dilated. "This is life. This is passion." Meanwhile, Elara Vance had disappeared. Or rather, she had returned to her world. She'd taken up residence in her family's 6-story limestone townhouse on East 72nd Street, a fortress of quiet old-world power. She wasn't mourning. She was working. Her days were spent in the climate-controlled archives of her family's private art foundation. She was planning, not revenge. Revenge was so messy. Elara was planning a correction, a market adjustment. She had lunch with her uncle Julian Vance at Le Bernardin. Julian was a man who spoke in whispers, but whose words could destabilize governments. He was the patriarch, the true head of the Vance dynasty. "You're well, Elara?" he asked, tasting his wine. "I'm very well, Uncle Julian." "This person, Sterling, he was indiscreet. He was disrespectful. To you and, by extension, to this family. He's a product of his time," Elara said. "He believes his own press. And Page 6 is a poor substitute for the Wall Street Journal," Julian noted. "He's over-leveraged. His new Dubai project is ambitious. Ambitious. He's financed it with junk bonds and handshake deals with questionable partners," Julian said. "He needs a massive infusion of capital in the next 6 months or the entire tower of cards collapses." Elara was silent, sipping her water. "He's exposed," Julian continued. "He thinks that house in Southampton is his fortress. He doesn't realize it's his primary liability. The upkeep alone is astronomical, and his new companion has famously expensive taste." "She does," Elara agreed. "A man who builds his house on sand," Julian mused. "Sooner or later the tide comes in. Tell me, Elara, that house, did you ever like it?" Elara thought for a moment. "I liked the view. The land is significant. The house itself is an insult to architecture." Julian Vance nodded slowly, a small, cold smile touching his lips. "Significant land? Yes, it is." He signaled for the check. "I'm glad you're back, Elara. It's time to get back to the family business." The next 6 months were a blur of golden, glorious, expensive chaos for Richard Sterling. Life with Isabella was a non-stop performance. It was fashion weeks in Milan, F1 in Monaco, and impromptu trips to Tokyo to buy rare Rolex watches. Richard was funding a lifestyle not just for one person, but for Isabella's entire 15-person entourage. You have to spend money to make money. Baby, she'd shout over the music in a club, ordering another $25,000 bottle of Ace of Spades, champagne, to be sprayed over the crowd. Richard, caught in the undertow of her youth and fame, would just laugh and sign the bill. But back in New York, the numbers weren't working. The Sterling Tower in Dubai, his legacy project, was in trouble. He was at his desk in his sleek Manhattan office, a glass box overlooking Central Park. His assistant, Greg, a nervous young man who lived in terror of him, was reading the latest report. "Sir, the Al-Jamil family. They've pulled their second-round funding," Greg stammered, afraid to make eye contact. "What pulled it?" "Pulled it. They promised me that 200 million. I had dinner with the sheikh." Richard roared, slamming his fist on his desk. They said they were re-evaluating their international real estate exposure. Sir, their banker. It's the Vance Trust." Richard froze. Vance. What the hell does Ilara's dusty old family have to do with my Dubai deal? They don't, exactly. But the Vance Trust holds the note on the Al-Jamil family's London properties. The word is the Vances advised them to pull back from high-risk developments. High risk, I'm high risk. Richard was vibrating with rage. I'm Richard Sterling. I'm the safest bet in the world. Sir, without that 200 million, we can't make the next construction payment. The entire project will halt. The penalty clauses are staggering. "Get me a loan," Richard shouted. "Call Goldman. Call J.P. Morgan. Use the Sterling point as collateral. It's worth 80 million easy. I'll get 40 million by tomorrow." Greg looked even sicker. "Sir, I tried. Both banks. They've declined. Declined. My credit is flawless. They said the asset is too specialized, a single-owner trophy home. They said its valuation is subjective. And, sir, our company's debt-to-liquid asset ratio is too high. Too high. It's high because I'm building things you can't build without debt." But he knew what it meant. The banks were spooked. That dusty old Vance name, whispered in the right boardroom, carried more weight than all his Forbes covers combined. The Vances didn't have to do anything. They just had to suggest. They were the house, and he was just a gambler on a losing streak. He flew back to Southampton that night in his helicopter, his stomach in knots. He was $200 million short. He was burning through his personal cash at a rate of $1 million a week just to keep Isabella happy. He landed on the helipad of his mansion to find a full-scale rave in progress. A famous DJ was set up by the pool. There were at least 300 people on his lawn. He stormed into the house, finding Isabella dancing on a custom-made marble table, a magnum of tequila in her hand. "Isabella! What the hell is this?" he screamed, grabbing her arm. "It's a party, baby! Lighten up!" she shrieked, clearly drunk. "I'm celebrating my new Vogue cover. I don't care about your damn cover. We have to stop this, the spending, all these leeches." He gestured at her friends. Isabella's face turned from joy to a cold reptilian fury in an instant. She jumped off the table. "Leeches. These are my friends. This is my career. This is the life you promised me. Don't you dare come in here and try to be boring. Don't be hurt, Ilara. Your boring, frigid old wife. Is that what you want? To go back to her because I can be on a plane to Paris in an hour. Richard, there are a dozen billionaires who would beg to pay for my parties." The threat was clear. The passion and fire he'd left his wife for was entirely conditional. It was a transaction. He was paying for the experience of being with Isabella Monet, and he had just missed a payment. No baby, of course. Not. He stammered, his anger deflating into panic. He couldn't lose her. Not now. Losing her would be a public admission that he'd failed. It would be the final humiliation. I'm just stressed. The Dubai project. Ugh, business. She scoffed, rolling her eyes. Don't be so needy, Richard. Go get a drink. She turned her back on him and cranked the music louder. Richard stood there, invisible in his own home, surrounded by strangers, the music pulsing like a migraine. He was hemorrhaging money from every direction. The $80 million mansion suddenly felt like a tomb. He had to get liquid. He had to get it now. Greg, he barked into his phone, walking to a quiet corner of the estate. Put the house on the market. Tomorrow. Sir. The Sterling Point. Yes. Are you deaf? But be discreet. I don't want a for sale sign. I want an off-market listing. Target Russian oligarchs, Chinese billionaires, someone who wants a trophy and will pay cash. Price $85 million. Not a penny less. He hung up. He looked at the house, lit up against the night sky, pulsing with music he hated. It was his greatest triumph, and now he had to sell it to pay for the supermodel who was ignoring him. The irony was so bitter he could barely breathe. Elara Vance, meanwhile, was having a renaissance. She had done something no Vance had done in 50 years. She'd opened a public-facing business. It was a small 3-story gallery in Chelsea called Vance Contemporary. It was an instant, staggering success. Not because it was flashy, but because it was the opposite. The opening night featured no celebrities, no DJs, no paparazzi. It featured 4 unknown painters, a string quartet playing Shostakovich and Elara herself in a simple black dress passionately explaining the brushwork of a young artist from Belgium. The New York Times art critic, a notoriously difficult man named Harrison Dubois, wrote a 2-page spread. For years, he wrote, "Art has become a commodity, a plaything for the new money investor." With Vance Contemporary, Elara. Vance has done the impossible. She has made art again. She is without question the most important new voice in the art world. She has the one thing the market flippers lack: taste. Collectors' museums and old money patrons flocked to her. She was the new arbiter of class. In leaving Richard, she hadn't become invisible. She had become essential. She was photographed at museum galas, not as a +1, but as the guest of honor. Richard saw the articles. He saw the pictures of Elara looking serene, intelligent, and powerful, surrounded by people who wouldn't return his calls. He'd scroll through them, his knuckles white, then switch to Isabella's Instagram, which was full of selfies in bikinis and videos of her drunk at 3 a.m. He had traded a Rolex for a Swatch, and the world knew it. His professional life was unraveling just as fast. The listing for the Sterling Point was a disaster. The discreet off-market offering had of course been leaked to the New York Post. Sterling's point of no return. Mogul's $85 billion palace on the block as Dubai project stalls. The story cast a pall over his company. Suddenly contractors were demanding payment up front. Lenders were calling in minor debts, the sharks were circling, and the house wouldn't sell. "What do you mean, no offers?" Richard bellowed at the high-end broker. It's the most famous house in the Hamptons." "Famous, yes," the broker, a sleek woman named Samantha, said coolly. "But it's a very specific taste, Richard. The gold leaf walls, the nightclub-grade sound system. It's not what the current market wants. The current market wants, well, frankly, they want what Elara Vance has. Quiet, timeless, old-world charm." "It's a monument," he insisted. "Monuments are for history books. People want homes." He was trapped. He couldn't lower the price. It would be an admission of desperation. He couldn't not sell because the Dubai penalties were mounting, and Isabella had just discovered a passion for haute couture gowns, which she wore once and then discarded. He was sitting in his office, his head in his hands, when Greg knocked. "Sir, there's an offer on the house." Richard shot up. "Who? How much was it, the Russian?" "No, sir. It's an LLC, a domestic corporation based in Delaware. It's called Arrowhead Holdings." "Arrowhead, never heard of them. What's the offer?" They're offering full asking price, $85 million. Richard stared. "Full asking in this market?" "Yes, sir. And—" Greg paused, checking the paper. "All cash. They waive all inspections, and they want to close in 10 days. It was a miracle, a lifeline. He was saved. "Take it," Richard yelled. "Take it. I don't care if it's the cartel. Draft the papers. Get it done. Now." "Yes, sir," Greg scrambled out. Richard poured himself a massive glass of Macallan 25. He was back. He was Richard Sterling. He'd done it again. He'd stared into the abyss, and he hadn't blinked. He picked up his phone to call Isabella to tell her they were going to celebrate. She didn't answer. Her Instagram story showed she was in Paris at a fitting at the Chanel atelier. "Oops," the caption read. A picture of a $100,000 dress was next. He didn't even care. He was $85 million richer. He could pay for the dress. He could fund Dubai. He was back. The closing was set for the following Friday. Richard, in his arrogance, planned one last "fuck you" party at the mansion for the night before. He would drain the cellars, trash the place, and hand the keys to the anonymous buyers in the morning. Elara heard the news from her uncle. "Arrowhead Holdings has an accepted offer," Julian said over the phone. He was at his desk looking at a painting of a naval battle. "Is it done then?" Elara asked. She was at her own gallery, prepping for a new show. "Almost. The rat has taken the cheese," Julian said. "He's planning a party, a final desecration. I think it's time to finalize the transaction. Publicly." "What do you mean? The house is yours, my dear. Or rather, it's the foundation's. I thought you might like to be there for the final walkthrough. After all, you have to accept the keys." A slow smile spread across Elara's face. "Uncle Julian, you are a menace." "I am a Vance, Elara. As are you. We protect our own, and we tidy up. I'll send a car for you on Friday, 10 a.m. Wear something appropriate." The party was apocalyptic. Richard, flush with the impending $85 million, had decided to burn the house to the ground, metaphorically. He flew in Tiesto to DJ. He hired the entire staff of Nobu to cater. He told Isabella to invite everyone, and she did. By 3 a.m., the house was a wreck. A rented Lamborghini was in the infinity pool. The new animal print carpets were stained with wine and ash. Someone had inexplicably spray-painted Isabella's palace on the white marble wall of the atrium. Richard didn't care. He was drunk, victorious, and surrounded by beautiful, shallow people. He felt like a Roman emperor. "To me," he toasted, standing on the bar, champagne pouring down his shirt. To Richard F. King Sterling. To Richard, they all screamed back, none of them knowing or caring that he was a hair's breadth from total bankruptcy. When the sun rose, the scene was one of utter devastation. The staff, paid triple, were trying to scrub the evidence away. Richard was passed out in a cabana. Isabella was long gone, having left with a musician for an after-party. At 9 a.m., Greg, his eyes twitching, had to physically shake his boss awake. Sir, the buyers. They're here. The final walkthrough is at 10 a.m. Ugh. What? Richard sat up, his head splitting. They're here. Why so early? It's 10 a.m., sir. As scheduled. Fine. Richard splashed water on his face, put on a pair of sunglasses, and swallowed 4 aspirin. He was still in his tuxedo from the night before. Let's get this over with. Give me the keys. I'll meet them. Get the check, and we're gone. He stumbled out onto the grand driveway, which was littered with confetti and broken glass. He saw a car approaching, but it wasn't the Maybach or Rolls-Royce he expected from a billionaire buyer. It was a 1960s Bentley S2 Continental, a quiet, elegant, old money car, painted a discreet shade of dark green. It crunched to a halt. A driver in a simple black suit got out and opened the rear door. Out stepped Mr. Harrison, his ancient, judgmental lawyer. Harrison, Richard barked, confused. What the hell are you doing here? Mr. Sterling, Harrison said, with a sniff of disdain looking at the debauchery. I am here representing the buyers. The buyers you, who is it, who is Arrowhead Holdings? A second person emerged from the car. It was Elara. She was wearing a cream-colored Loro Piana cashmere coat and simple trousers. Her hair was pulled back. She looked calm, rested, and utterly in control. She looked at the house, at the graffiti, at the hung-over state of her ex-husband, and her expression didn't flicker. Elara, Richard whispered. His blood ran cold. The aspirin, the champagne, the victory, it all curdled in his stomach. Richard, she said, her voice even. You've been busy. You bought my house, he stammered, a laugh bordering on a sob escaping his lips. You bought this to... What? To get back at me. You spent $85 million to spite me. He was grasping, trying to find a narrative where he was still the main character. Don't be ridiculous, Richard, Elara said, as if speaking to a child. I didn't buy your house. I don't have $85 million in liquid cash. That's your game. Then, who? Arrowhead Holdings, she said, is a subsidiary of the Vance Family Foundation. The foundation did buy your house, or rather, as I told my uncle. They bought the land. The view. Richard's mind was failing to compute. The foundation. A charity. What does a charity want with a mansion? Oh, they don't, Elara said. She walked past him towards the front door, which was hanging slightly off one hinge. They have no use for the house at all. I don't understand, Richard said, following her, panic rising in his throat. The foundation, Elara explained, stopping in the atrium and looking up at the grotesque spray-painted graffiti, is in the process of building the new Vance Wing for the New York Museum of Modern Art, a project that unfortunately was delayed by an investor who defaulted on his pledge. She looked at him. He was that investor. He'd pledged $50 million to the museum, to get his name on a wall and had quietly defaulted 3 months ago. The foundation, she continued, has decided to liquidate some of its less essential real estate holdings to fund the wing themselves. For instance, this incredibly valuable plot of land in Southampton. Liquidate, you just bought it. Yes, an acquisition and a liquidation, Elara said. We've already resold it. Richard's world tilted. Resold it. To who, for how much? We sold it to the developer who owns the adjacent 3 properties. He's been trying to acquire this land for a decade to build his new golf course. He paid $95 million. The $10 million profit will be a lovely donation to the foundation. $95 million? Richard's knees felt weak. He'd been so desperate he'd sold to the first offer, not even realizing he'd left $10 million on the table. But the house. Oh, the developer. He hates the house too, Elara said. He's tearing it down. The demolition crew arrives at noon. Richard physically recoiled. Tearing it down? My house. My masterpiece. It's not a masterpiece, Richard. It's a badly built nightclub with a plumbing problem. The demolition, she added, checking her watch, is in 1 hour. This was the final blow. It wasn't just a sale. It wasn't revenge. It was erasure. He wasn't even a footnote. He was a mistake that was being bulldozed. But why? He whispered, sinking onto a ruined velvet ottoman. Why? You, Elara. Why do this to me? Elara turned to him, and the ice was back. Do this to you, Richard. You seem to be under the impression that this was about you. It wasn't. You defaulted on the Al-Jamil loan. My uncle's bank held the note. You defaulted on your pledge to the museum. My family chairs the museum. You weren't a rival, Richard. You were a mess. We were simply tidying up. This was just business. Business, he repeated numbly. Yes, you taught me that. You said your money was real and my family was dusty. You just forgot something. Dust settles, but it never goes away. The Vance dynasty was here 100 years before you, and it will be here 100 years after you're gone. Mr. Harrison stepped forward. Mr. Sterling, the funds have been wired to your account, minus the $50 million pledge you defaulted on to the museum, for which the foundation graciously covered your debt, and of course the closing costs and the $50,000 fee for cleaning this. Richard looked at his phone. A wire transfer alert. The $85 million had become $34.9 million. Enough to stop the immediate bleeding on the Dubai project, but not nearly enough to save it. It was a mortal wound. You bitch! He spat the word, lacking any force. Elara didn't even flinch. Goodbye, Richard. I hope you find the fire you were looking for. She turned and walked out the door, stepping gracefully over a shattered baccarat vase. Richard Sterling sat alone in the ruins of his $84 million monument, the sound of the ocean drowned out by the approaching rumble of bulldozers. He didn't move. He just stared at the wall where Isabella's palace was already starting to peel. He collapsed, not a physical faint, but a complete, hollow-eyed spiritual surrender. He just gave up. The demolition of the Sterling Point was efficient and brutal. By 4 p.m. it was rubble. By the end of the week, the land was flat as if the house had never existed. The Post ran a single snarky headline, Sterling's house flip, Flops. Vance family. Tears down tacky mansion. The public humiliation was total. Richard Sterling was radioactive. The $35 million he'd cleared was vaporized in 2 weeks, eaten by penalty fees from Dubai and the avalanche of creditors who, seeing the news, demanded their money now. He tried to call Isabella. She was in Milan, and her phone went straight to voicemail. He texted her, "I'm in trouble, baby. I need you." She texted back 5 hours later, "Richard, I'm sorry. I can't be with a man who isn't successful. It's bad for my brand. My publicist will release a statement. I wish you the best." He was in his rented Tribeca penthouse. The lease was up in 30 days when he saw her Instagram post. She was on a yacht in Lake Como with the Al Jamil Sheikh. "New Horizons," the caption read. Richard threw his phone against the wall. It shattered. A week later, Sterling Properties filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy. The Dubai Tower was seized by his partners. His Manhattan office, his fleet of cars, his Tom Ford suits, all were seized by the bank. He was, for the first time since he was 20 years old, completely and totally broke. He was worse than broke. He was in debt, and his name was toxic. Elara Vance read the news on Bloomberg while sitting in her office at the Chelsea Gallery. She was reviewing the catalogue for her next show, New Perspectives in Postmodern Sculpture. Her assistant knocked. "Miss Vance, Mr. Richard Sterling is here to see you." Elara looked up, surprised. "Here? Yes, he doesn't have an appointment. He looks unwell." Elara considered it for a moment. "Fine, send him in, and bring 2 coffees." Richard entered. He was a different man. His suit was wrinkled, his face was gaunt, and the arrogant fire in his eyes was gone. He was just a tired, defeated man. "Elara," he said, his voice hoarse. "Richard, this is a surprise," she said, gesturing to a chair. He sat. I don't know why I'm here," he said, staring at his hands. "I guess I wanted to see, to ask what Richard for money for, what pity. I want to know. Was it all a lie?" he whispered. "Our 10 years. Did you ever love me? Or was I just amusing?" Elara looked at him, and the ice in her demeanor softened just slightly into a cold, clear water. "I did love you, Richard. Once. A long time ago. I loved your drive, your energy. I loved that you weren't like the boys I grew up with. You built things. I admired that. Then why? Because you stopped loving me," she said, her voice firm. "You stopped seeing me. You saw Vance. You saw a trophy. And when that wasn't shiny enough, you traded it in for a different one. You didn't just leave me, Richard. You dismissed me. You dismissed my family, my life, my worth. You stood in the house my family's name helped you build, and you told me I was nothing without you." She leaned forward. All of this, she gestured to the bankruptcy news on her screen. "This wasn't my uncle. This wasn't my family. This was you. My family just let it happen. They removed the safety net you never even knew you had. You built your empire on a foundation of Vance credit, Vance connections, and Vance tolerance. When you betrayed me, you didn't just lose a wife. You lost your entire infrastructure." Richard just stared, the full, devastating truth finally landing. He hadn't been a self-made man. He had been a sponsored one. What do I do now?" he asked, a broken man. "I don't know, Richard," Elara said. She pushed one of the coffees toward him. "You're a builder. You said so yourself. So, build. Start over. This time, build it on rock, not sand. He looked at the coffee. He looked at her. She was a queen in her own right, secure, powerful, and fair. He stood up, not touching the drink. Goodbye, Elara, he said. Goodbye, Richard. He walked out of the gallery, past the priceless art, and onto the street. He was just a man in a rumpled suit. He had no car, no home, no one. He started walking with no destination in mind. 1 year later, the Southampton landscape had changed. Where the Stirling Point had once stood, there was now a sprawling, beautiful one-story public art pavilion. It was called the Vance Pavilion for the Arts. It was a masterpiece of glass fieldstone and light designed by a Pritzker prize-winning architect. It housed a rotating collection of sculptures and offered free art classes to the community. Its gardens, which ran down to the ocean, were open to the public. Elara Vance was at the opening ceremony. She wasn't in the spotlight. She was in the crowd watching a group of local children learning to paint the ocean. Her uncle Julian stood beside her. It's beautiful, Elara, he said. A much better use of the view. It is, she agreed. It feels right. The New York Times ran a glowing piece on it. A monument to generosity. How Elara Vance turned a symbol of 21st century excess into a beacon of public culture. She had taken Richard's monument to ego and transformed it into a legacy of culture. In Milan, Isabella Monet was photographed arguing with the Al-Jamil Sheikh, who had just traded her in for an even younger 19-year-old influencer from Russia. Her Vogue covers had dried up. She was last seen hosting a Red Bull promotion on a beach in Ibiza. Her fire had burned out. And Richard Stirling. He was in Austin, Texas. He was working as a junior project manager for a small commercial construction firm. He lived in a rented one-bedroom apartment. He was driving a Ford Focus. He was in fact building. He was starting over. He kept a small laminated clipping in his wallet. It wasn't of his old Forbes covers. It was the article about Elara's new pavilion. He was at a building site in a hard hat, yelling at a contractor about rebar, when his phone rang. It was an unknown New York number. He answered. Stirling? Richard, it's Elara. He froze. Elara. Wow. Hello. Hello. I heard you were in Austin, that you were building again. Yeah, small stuff, office parks, but it's honest work, he said. I know, she said. My foundation. We're funding a new low-income housing project in East Austin. We need a senior manager, someone who knows how to build but who also knows what it's like to lose it all. Someone who'll build it right. Richard was silent. He couldn't speak. It's a job, Richard, she said, her voice not cold, not warm, but clear. If you want it, it's a chance to build something that lasts. He looked at the dusty blueprint in his hand, then at the sky. He had lost his mansion. He had lost his wife. He had lost his Montpellier, but in the ruins he'd found a single, tiny, buried seed. Yes, he said, his voice thick. Elara. Yes, I'd like that. She had bought his mansion. She had torn it down. And in doing so, she had given him the one thing his millions could never buy a chance at redemption. Thank you for watching this story. We see so often in life that the loudest person in the room is often the weakest. Richard Stirling built his entire life on the idea of power, but Elara Vance wielded the reality of it. She didn't have to scream. She just had to wait. She knew that true power, true legacy isn't about what you own. It's about what you can build, what you can give, and what you're willing to protect. What did you think of Ilara's ultimate move? Was it cold-blooded revenge, or was it simply the consequences of Richard's own actions? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. If you enjoyed this story and want more tales of drama justice and the powerful lessons of life, please make sure to like this video. Share it with someone who needs to see it, and subscribe to our channel for new stories every week.
Millionaire dad watches waitress feed his disabled son and changes her life forever. The clatter of silverware against porcelain was the only sound Alistair Blackwood registered. A grating, chaotic symphony of his own impatience. He watched from across the bustling diner, his jaw tight enough to crack stone, as the waitress knelt beside his son, Daniel. It was an act of agonizing slowness. She wasn't just taking an order. She was carefully, patiently, feeding the boy who couldn't feed himself, lifting a small piece of grilled cheese to his lips as if it were a sacrament. A simple act of kindness, yet Alistair saw it as a performance of pity, a public spectacle of his family's private, gnawing struggle. He felt the familiar hot shame curl in his gut, a venomous serpent coiling around his pride. This woman, with her worn-out shoes, a small hole visible near the toe, and a cheap, faded uniform, was making a show of his son's disability. Worse, she was making a show of his failure as a father, and he was a man who didn't tolerate being made a show of. He reached for his wallet, the supple Italian leather, cool and firm in his hand, a familiar anchor in a world that suddenly felt disorderly. He would deal with this. He would pay her off. A clean, swift transaction to make her and this entire humiliating moment disappear. He would erase it from his memory, burying it under the weight of his wealth. He always did. Alistair Blackwood was a man sculpted from granite and ambition, his edges sharpened by the ruthless calculus of high finance. His name was a fixture in the financial pages, a byword for aggressive takeovers and astronomical profits. His fortune was a monument to a ruthless and unwavering focus, a testament to a life lived in the pursuit of absolute control. He lived in a world of clean lines and predictable outcomes, a sterile empire of glass and steel where every variable could be quantified, managed, and bent to his will. His son, Daniel, was the one equation he could never solve, the one variable that defied every one of his attempts at control. At 17, Daniel was trapped in a body that had betrayed him since a childhood accident left him with severe cerebral palsy. His mind was a brilliant, vibrant thing, a caged bird beating its wings against the bars of his uncooperative limbs. His speech was a frustrating puzzle of slurred syllables and labored breaths, a constant source of agony for the boy and a torment of impatience for his father. For Alistair, Daniel was a constant, painful reminder of his own limitations, a deep, undeniable crack in the perfect, polished facade of his life. He loved his son with a fierce, possessive ache, a love so profound it terrified him. But it was a love suffocated by pride, a love chained to a deep-seated, pathological fear of weakness in any form, especially within his own bloodline. The diner, a place called the Corner Booth, was a necessary evil, a monthly pilgrimage of discomfort. It was the only place on their long drive to a specialized neurological clinic in another state that Daniel genuinely, openly enjoyed. The boy, in his frustratingly simple way, loved the chaotic energy, the smell of frying bacon mingling with burnt coffee, and the unpretentious democratic hum of ordinary life. For Alistair, it was an hour of purgatory. He hated the sticky menus, the chipped coffee mugs that felt unclean in his hands, and most of all, the way people's eyes would linger on Daniel's wheelchair, their gazes a mixture of pity and morbid curiosity that felt like a physical assault. The waitress was new. He hadn't seen her on their previous half-dozen visits. Her name tag, slightly askew, read Lena. She had tired eyes, deep-set and shadowed, but they held a flicker of something bright and resilient, a stubborn light that refused to be extinguished. When she first approached their table, Alistair had given her his usual, clipped, dismissive order for a black coffee, a clear, unspoken signal that he wanted minimal interaction, a swift and efficient transaction. But Lena hadn't taken the hint. She had smiled, a small, genuine curve of her lips, not at him, but directly at Daniel. "What's good today, boss?" she'd asked the boy, her voice warm and direct, stripped of the condescending, high-pitched tone most people used with him. She spoke to him as if he were an equal, an old friend. Daniel had struggled to form a response, his mouth working to shape the words, a low, frustrated sound escaping his lips. Alistair had felt a familiar surge of irritation, a hot wave of impatience that was quickly followed by a cold tide of shame. He hated this part. The awkward, gaping pause while strangers tried to decipher his son's speech, their faces a mask of strained politeness. He was about to cut in, to order for Daniel as he always did, to smooth over the uncomfortable moment and restore efficiency. But Lena held up a hand, a small, gentle gesture of patience, her fingers stained with a little ink. "Take your time," she said, her eyes never leaving Daniel's, her focus absolute. "I'm not going anywhere. The world can wait." And so, Alistair watched, a silent, seething observer, as his son, with a painstaking, heroic effort that made Alistair's chest tighten, managed to articulate his order for a chocolate milkshake and a grilled cheese sandwich. And Lena had listened, truly listened, nodding along, her head tilted, as if he were reciting poetry, as if his garbled words were the most important thing she would hear all day. It was an intimacy that felt like an intrusion, a secret connection forged in a language of patience that Alistair had never bothered, or perhaps never dared, to learn. Now, as Lena fed his son, cutting the sandwich into small, manageable pieces, and wiping a stray crumb from his lip, Alistair felt that intrusion sharpen into a direct threat. He saw it as a judgment on his own fatherhood, a silent, damning accusation of his own impatience and emotional distance. He saw her kindness not as a virtue, but as a weapon, a carefully calculated tool to extract a bigger tip, to play on the sympathy of the wealthy man with the disabled son. He was a man who understood transactions, who saw the hidden ledger in every human interaction, and this, in his mind, was just another one. He would make his move, re-establish control, and put this woman and her performative compassion back in her place. Alistair waited, a predator coiled in the cracked vinyl booth, until Lena had wiped a stray bit of cheese from Daniel's chin and shared a quiet laugh with the boy over some whispered joke. The sight of it, so natural and unforced, the easy joy on his son's face, was like a stone in his shoe, a constant, irritating pressure. He cleared his throat, a sound as sharp and commanding as a gavel striking oak. It was a sound that had silenced boardrooms. Lena looked up, her smile fading slightly as she met his cold, imperious gaze. "Can I get you anything else, sir? More coffee?" "Your time," Alistair said, his voice low and flat, stripped of all warmth. He slid a crisp, new $100 bill from his wallet and pushed it across the sticky table. The green of the note was a stark, jarring contrast to the faded formica. "I appreciate your service, but I'll take it from here." The implication was clear, crude, and intentional. "Here is your payment for the performance. Now leave us alone." It was a dismissal, a transaction designed to demean and subordinate. Lena looked at the money, her eyes lingering on it for a moment, then back at Alistair. She didn't touch the bill. A flicker of something unreadable crossed her face. Not anger, as he'd expected, but something closer to disappointment, a quiet sadness that irritated him even more. "I'm just helping him eat his lunch," she said, her voice even, refusing to accept the terms of his transaction. "It's part of my job. We help customers who need it. Your job is to take orders and bring food," Alistair countered, his tone hardening, each word a carefully polished stone of condescension. "What you're doing is unnecessary. It's drawing attention." "He asked for my help," Lena replied simply, her gaze shifting back to Daniel, pointedly excluding Alistair from their shared world. "Didn't you, Danny?" Daniel, who had been watching the exchange with anxious, darting eyes, gave a small, jerky nod, his loyalty clear. The use of the nickname, so casual and achingly familiar, grated on Alistair's nerves like nails on a chalkboard. It was a claim of intimacy he had no right to. "His name is Daniel," Alistair snapped, the words coming out sharper than he intended. "And I am perfectly capable of assisting my own son." It was a lie, and a bitter, hollow one. He wasn't capable. Not really. He had nurses for that, a team of highly paid professionals who handled the messy, intimate details of Daniel's care. He provided, he managed, he directed from a distance. He didn't do. The few times he'd tried, in the privacy of their sterile, silent home, his own frustration and visceral clumsiness had made the situation worse, leaving both him and Daniel feeling defeated, a gulf of unspoken failure between them. Lena picked up another piece of the sandwich, her movements unhurried. "I'm sure you are," she said, her voice soft but with an edge of steel that caught him completely off guard. "But right now, I'm the one with the sandwich, and he's the one who's hungry." She fed the piece to Daniel, her movements fluid and practiced, a simple, irrefutable act of care. It was a checkmate delivered with a piece of grilled cheese. Alistair was left speechless, the $100 bill lying between them like a surrender flag he had foolishly, arrogantly offered. He was a man who negotiated multi-million-dollar deals, who could bend corporate boards and international markets to his will with a single phone call. Yet in this greasy spoon diner, he had been utterly, comprehensively disarmed by a waitress who refused to play by his rules, who refused to be bought. He felt a flush of anger, hot and potent. He could have made a scene. The thought was a satisfying flash of power. He could have demanded to see the manager, a man he could see in the back, sweating over a grill. He could have her fired, her life disrupted, all with a few well-chosen, cutting words. But then he looked at his son. Daniel was watching him, a silent, desperate plea in his eyes. "Don't, Dad. Please, don't ruin this." Alistair leaned back in the booth, the vinyl groaning under his weight, his jaw clenched so tight it ached. He withdrew the $100 bill, the crisp paper now feeling flimsy and useless in his hand. He had tried to control the situation with the only tool he truly understood: money. And he had failed spectacularly. For the rest of the meal, he sat in a storm of silent, impotent fury, watching as Lena and Daniel shared a world that was utterly closed to him. She didn't just feed him. She talked to him, asked him about his day, about the clinic, about a movie he'd seen, and she listened with an intensity, a focused presence that Alistair knew, with a fresh stab of guilt, he rarely gave his own son. When it was time to leave, Alistair paid the bill at the register, the exact amount, down to the cent, and in a final, petty act of defiance, left a deliberately insulting tip on the table. A single, folded dollar bill. It was a childish, spiteful gesture, and he knew it. It was a final attempt to assert his dominance, to leave a sting, to have the last word. As he wheeled Daniel toward the door, pushing the chair with more force than necessary, Lena's voice stopped him. "Sir?" He turned, his body tensing, expecting a confrontation, perhaps even welcoming it as a release for his coiled frustration. "You forgot this," she said, her voice calm and steady. She held out the single-dollar bill between her thumb and forefinger as if it were a contaminated object. "I think you need it more than I do." She didn't wait for a response. She placed the dollar on a nearby empty table, its surface gleaming with a recent wipe-down, and walked away, back to her work, leaving Alistair standing in the middle of the diner, the weight of her quiet, unassailable dignity pressing down on him far more heavily than any outburst ever could. The humiliation was absolute, a cold, creeping sensation that settled deep in his bones. It wasn't just that she had refused his money. She had rejected his entire value system, the very foundation of his power. And she had done it in front of his son. The monthly drive to the clinic, once a tedious chore, became a source of active dread for Alistair. It wasn't the sterile corridors or the pitying glances of other parents that he feared anymore. It was the corner booth and the ghost of his humiliation. Daniel, however, seemed to come alive as they approached the small, unremarkable town. On their next visit, a month later, Alistair's plan was simple. He would drive right past, feign ignorance, and find some other, less humiliating place to eat. A sterile, predictable chain restaurant where the staff were trained to be anonymous and transactions were blessedly impersonal. "Dad, we're passing it," Daniel said, his voice strained with a rare and potent disappointment, his words clearer than usual. He pointed a trembling finger out the window. "They're probably busy, son. It's the lunch rush. We'll find somewhere else, somewhere quicker." It was a weak lie, and they both knew it. "No," Daniel insisted, his voice stronger, more forceful than Alistair had heard it in years. "I want to go there. I want to see Lena." The way he said her name, with such simple, unadorned affection and hope, twisted something sharp and painful in Alistair's chest. With a sigh of defeat, he pulled the car into the diner's gravel parking lot, his knuckles white on the leather steering wheel. He felt like a general walking into a battle he had already comprehensively lost. Lena was there. And she greeted Daniel with a smile that was pure, unadulterated sunshine. A smile that seemed to momentarily erase the exhaustion from her face. She didn't even glance at Alistair, rendering him completely invisible. The meal was a painful repeat of the last, a quiet, intricate ballet of care between Lena and Daniel that excluded him entirely. He sat in silence, a king in exile, stewing in his own irrelevance. He tried to work on his phone, to project an air of bored, unassailable importance, but he found his eyes drawn back to them again and again. He was witnessing a connection he couldn't buy, couldn't control, and, most damningly, couldn't understand. Determined to reassert himself, to dig under her skin and find a weakness, he decided on a new, crueler tactic. He would uncover her angle. Everyone had one. He waited until Daniel was happily preoccupied with a coloring page of a stegosaurus that Lena had given him, then walked with feigned casualness to the counter where she was refilling salt shakers with a small metal funnel. "You know," he began, his voice laced with a condescending, faux casual curiosity, "you're very good at this. The whole caring waitress routine. You must do very well in tips from the right kind of people." Lena didn't look up from her work, the tiny crystals of salt whispering into the shaker. "I get by. I'm sure you do." Alistair pressed on, leaning against the counter, invading her space. "A pretty young woman like you, showing a little extra attention to the right customers. It's a smart strategy. Find the lonely ones, the vulnerable ones, and play the part." She finally stopped, placing the salt shaker down with a soft, deliberate click. She looked at him, her gaze so direct and clear it was disarming, stripping away his layers of sarcasm. "Is that what you think this is? A strategy?" "Everything is a strategy," Alistair said with a dismissive shrug, the cynical mantra of his life. It's just a matter of figuring out the endgame. So what's yours? You hoping for a handout? A sob story about your student loans, your sick mother? A down payment for a car? Let's cut to the chase. He was being cruel, deliberately so. He wanted to provoke a reaction, to see a crack in her infuriatingly calm facade, to force her down to his level. Lena's expression didn't change, but a profound, deep-seated sadness entered her eyes, extinguishing the resilient light he'd noticed before. "My endgame," she said, her voice barely a whisper, so quiet he had to lean in to hear it over the diner's hum, "is to get through my shift without crying in the walk-in freezer. My endgame is to make enough money to buy groceries for the week without having to put something back at the checkout. My endgame is to feel, for just a few minutes, like I'm making a small positive difference in someone's day." She picked up another shaker, her hand trembling slightly. "You see your son over there? The one you can't bear to look at for more than a few seconds without flinching? He's my endgame. Everything is for him." Alistair felt a cold, hard knot form in his stomach. The words were a quiet rebuke, but they landed like a physical blow. "Your son?" he asked, confused, his own line of attack forgotten. "You have a son." Lena finally turned to face him fully, her body language shifting from defensive to something much more vulnerable. "I had a son," she corrected, her voice trembling, the dam of her composure beginning to crack. "His name was Leo. He would have been 17 this year, just like Daniel." The air left Alistair's lungs in a sudden sharp rush. The noise of the diner, the clatter of plates and the murmur of conversation, all of it faded into a dull, distant roar. He felt dizzy, unmoored. "Leo was in an accident when he was a little boy," Lena continued, her eyes now locked on his, holding him captive in the force field of her grief. "A car accident. He was never the same. He couldn't walk. He couldn't feed himself. For 10 years, I did everything for him. But his smile could light up a whole room." She took a shaky, hitching breath. "He passed away 2 years ago. An infection. His lungs just gave out. It was quick." She glanced over at Daniel, who was now carefully, painstakingly coloring in the cartoon dinosaur, his tongue stuck out in concentration. A genuine, tender smile touched her lips, a smile of pure, unadulterated memory. "When I see your son, I see my Leo. I see the same frustration in his eyes, the same stubborn fight. And when I help him, when I cut up his food, or just talk to him, it feels like I'm getting to have one more lunch with my boy." The truth of it hit Alistair with the force of a physical blow, knocking the arrogance and cynicism right out of him. This wasn't a strategy. It wasn't a performance. It was a ghost. It was a mother's love, raw and bleeding and desperate, reaching out for a connection that had been stolen from her. And he, in his monumental arrogance and pride, had mistaken it for a hustle. He looked back at his own son, truly looked at him. And for the first time, he didn't see a symbol of his own failure or a source of public shame. He saw a boy who had, by some cosmic chance, found a moment of grace, a moment of profound connection with someone who understood his struggle in a way Alistair never could. Then, Lena delivered the final, devastating blow, her voice dropping to a near whisper, heavy with a significance that Alistair couldn't yet comprehend. A whisper that would echo in his soul forever. "The accident that took my Leo's future," she said, her eyes boring into his, unknowingly accusing. "It was a hit and run, on a rainy night, on the old highway just outside the city. 10 years ago. The driver was in a black sedan. A custom model, the police said. Imported. They never found him. They never even found a witness." Alistair's blood ran cold, turning to ice in his veins. A black sedan. A rainy night. The old highway. 10 years ago. The details swirled in his mind like a black vortex, pulling a memory from the deep, dark, locked recesses of his past, a memory he had buried under a mountain of money, lawyers, and willful denial. A night he had convinced himself was just a bad dream, a bump in the road, a close call. He remembered the jolt, the sickening, resonant thud that vibrated through the frame of the car. He'd told himself it was a deer. He'd been drinking, celebrating a major acquisition that had made him a billionaire. He hadn't stopped. He couldn't risk it. The scandal, the press, the breathalyzer, the damage to his empire just as it was reaching its zenith. He had just kept driving, his heart hammering against his ribs, his knuckles white on the wheel, and had never, ever looked back. He stared at Lena, at the profound, unknowing grief in her eyes, and the world tilted on its axis. He hadn't just witnessed an act of kindness, he had stumbled upon the living, breathing wreckage of his own darkest secret. The woman who was showing his son a compassion he was incapable of giving was the same woman whose life he had irrevocably, unthinkably shattered. His secret, the one he thought was buried forever, was standing right in front of him, serving him coffee and feeding his child. The drive to the clinic was a blur of rain-streaked asphalt and distorted reality. Alistair's hands, usually so steady on the wheel, trembled uncontrollably. The road ahead seemed to warp and twist, every shadow on the pavement a phantom of that rainy night a decade ago. Lena's words echoed in his head, a relentless, damning chorus, a black sedan, a custom model. They never found him. He wasn't just a millionaire dad watching a waitress with a flicker of annoyance. He was a killer, sitting across from the mother of the boy he had struck down and left for dead on the side of a desolate highway. The irony was so cruel, so grotesquely poetic. It felt like something out of a Greek tragedy orchestrated by a vengeful god. The universe wasn't just punishing him. It was mocking him with a masterpiece of cosmic cruelty. At the clinic, he went through the motions like an automaton, his mind 1,000 miles away, trapped in the spinning wreckage of his past. The doctor's words, the sterile smell of the examination room, the quiet hum of medical equipment. It was all background noise to the roaring inferno of his guilt. He looked at Daniel, at his own son, whose life had been so profoundly altered by a cruel twist of fate. And all he could see was Leo. He saw the future he had stolen, the years of struggle and unimaginable pain he had inflicted on Lena. His own suffering over Daniel's condition, which had once felt so monumental, so central to his existence, suddenly felt hollow and pathetic, a selfish indulgence in the face of the utter devastation he had wrought. He knew he couldn't go back to the diner. Not now. Not ever. The thought of facing Lena again, of looking into her grief-stricken eyes, knowing what he knew, was unbearable. He would find another route, another clinic, another state if he had to. He would do what he always did. Run. Bury the problem in money and distance. But as he was loading Daniel back into the car, a slow, arduous process, his son spoke, his voice quiet but clear. "Is Lena going to be okay?" The question was so innocent, so full of genuine, unselfish concern. It was like a knife twisting in Alistair's ribs. "What do you mean, son?" he managed to ask, his own voice sounding foreign to him. "She seemed sad today," Daniel said, his words slow but precise. "Sadder than usual, after she talked to you at the counter." Alistair froze, his hand hovering over the door handle. Daniel had seen. Of course, he had seen. He had sensed the shift, the dark, toxic undercurrent that had passed between him and Lena. His son, who struggled with so much, who the world so often dismissed, possessed an emotional clarity, an empathetic intelligence that he, with all his worldly success and power, sorely lacked. In that moment, standing in the sterile quiet of the clinic parking garage, Alistair saw his life laid out before him. A long, lonely, gilded road paved with secrets and evasions. He could keep running, keep burying his past under more layers of denial and wealth, and in doing so, teach his son the ultimate lesson, that the only way to deal with pain and guilt is to hide from it, to outrun it until you die. Or he could do the one thing he had never done in his entire insulated life. He could turn around and face the consequences of his actions, head on, without flinching. The choice was terrifying. It meant the end of everything he had built, the gleeful destruction of his reputation by the media he so despised, the certain loss of his freedom. It meant facing the raw, unfiltered hatred of the woman he had wronged in the most profound way imaginable. But the alternative, a lifetime of looking into his son's clear, knowing eyes and seeing the reflection of a coward and a fraud, was a prison of a different, more terrible kind. A prison for the soul. He gripped the steering wheel, the leather groaning under his tight grip. "Daniel," he said, his voice hoarse, cracking with the weight of his decision. "We have to go back." The drive back to the corner booth was the longest of Alistair's life. Every mile was a war fought within himself, between the ingrained instinct for self-preservation and the new, terrifying imperative for confession. When he pulled into the parking lot, the diner was quieter, the lunchtime rush having given way to the late afternoon lull. He could see Lena through the window, wiping down a table, her movements weary and mechanical. He took a deep, shuddering breath that felt like it was his last as a free man. He wheeled Daniel to the door, then stopped, his hand on the cool metal of the push bar. "Son," he said, his voice cracking, "I need you to wait here for a minute. There's something I have to do. Alone." Daniel looked at him, his eyes wide with a mixture of confusion and a dawning fear. But he saw the resolve in his father's face, a look he had never seen before. He nodded slowly. Alistair walked into the diner. The bell above the door chimed, a sound that now seemed to toll for him. Lena looked up, and a guarded, weary expression fell over her face. "I forgot something," she said, her tone flat, defensive, clearly assuming he was there to argue or insult her further. "Yes," Alistair said, his voice barely a whisper. "I did." He walked to her table, his legs feeling like they were moving through wet cement. He didn't know where to begin, how to utter the words that would detonate both of their lives. There was no script for this, no protocol. He just knew he had to. "Lena," he started, his throat tight, his mouth dry. "The accident, the one that took your son." She stiffened, her body going rigid, her eyes narrowing with suspicion and pain. "What about it?" "The black sedan!" he choked out, the words tasting like ash and bile in his mouth. "The custom model, the driver they never found." He looked at her, his face a mask of raw, undisguised anguish, and let the silence hang in the air, a silent, terrible, and absolute confession. He saw the flicker of confusion in her eyes, then the slow, dawning, horrifying realization. Her hand went to her mouth, a gasp catching in her throat. The color drained from her face, leaving it a ghostly white. The cleaning rag she was holding slipped from her numb fingers and fell to the floor with a soft, final thud. "It was you," she whispered, her voice filled with a dawning, soul-shattering horror that was worse than any scream. "It was you." The world seemed to stop. The quiet hum of the soda refrigerator, the distant clatter of a plate in the kitchen, it all ceased. There was only the sound of Lena's ragged, shallow breathing and the frantic, guilty hammering of Alistair's own heart. He had confessed. He had laid his soul bare. And now he stood before the judge, jury, and executioner he had created all those years ago on that dark, rainy highway, and waited for his sentence. The word yes was a shard of glass in Alistair's throat. He couldn't force it out. The confession had taken all his strength. He could only stand there, his carefully constructed world collapsing into dust and ruin around him, and give a single, sharp, damning nod. Lena stumbled back, her hand flying to her mouth as if to stifle a scream that had been building inside her for a decade. Her eyes, which had held such profound sadness, now blazed with a fire of pure, unadulterated hatred. It was a look that stripped him bare, that saw through the expensive suit and the powerful facade to the rotten, cowardly core of the man he was. "Get out!" she hissed, her voice trembling with a rage so potent, so intense it was terrifying to witness. "Get out!" He didn't move. He couldn't. He was rooted to the spot by the sheer force of her loathing. He deserved this. He deserved so much more. "Lena, Don't you say my name!" she spat, her voice rising, cracking with pain. "You don't have the right. You monster! You killed my baby, my sweet, innocent baby, and you just drove away?" The last words were a choked sob, a sound of such profound, bottomless agony that it physically hurt to hear. The diner's manager, a burly, balding man named Sal, came rushing out from the kitchen, a spatula in his hand. "Is everything all right here, Lena? Is this man bothering you?" Lena didn't take her eyes off Alistair, her gaze a physical weapon. "Call the police, Sal," she said, her voice shaking but resolute. "Call them right now. I want to report a hit and run." Alistair didn't protest. He simply stood there, his hands hanging uselessly at his sides, waiting for the inevitable. This was it. The end of his life as he knew it. He saw the manager fumbling for his phone, his thumb hovering over the screen, and a strange, unexpected sense of peace settled over him. It was the peace of surrender, the quiet calm that comes when the long, exhausting internal fight is finally over. But then, his gaze drifted past Lena, through the large, greasy plate glass window, and he saw Daniel. His son was watching, his face pale, his eyes wide with a fear that Alistair had never seen before. It wasn't just fear for his father's impending arrest. It was a deeper, more primal fear of abandonment, of being left alone in a world that he couldn't navigate by himself. And in that moment, Alistair knew that simply going to prison wasn't enough. That was the easy way out. It was a passive acceptance of his fate, a punishment that would, in its own way, absolve him. Redemption wasn't about punishment. It was about atonement, and atonement required action. It required a living penance. "Wait," he said, his voice finding a strength he didn't know he possessed. He looked at Lena, not with the arrogance of a man trying to buy his way out of trouble, but with the raw, soul-deep desperation of a man pleading for his very soul. "Going to jail won't bring him back," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "It won't change what I did. It won't undo a single second of your pain. But maybe I can do something. For you. For his memory." Lena laughed, a harsh, bitter, ugly sound that held no humor, only 10 years of curdled grief. "Do something? What could you possibly do? Write me a check? Is that how you fix everything, Mr. Blackwood? You throw your dirty money at it until it goes away?" "No," he said, shaking his head vehemently. "Not with money. With my life. My entire life." He made her a promise, a vow, right there in the middle of the diner, with the threat of police sirens hanging in the air. He would not just turn himself in. He would first unravel the life he had built on that lie. He would liquidate his assets, sell his companies, dismantle his entire empire, and put every last penny into a foundation in her son's name. The Leo Miller Foundation. It would help families with disabled children, families who were struggling the way she must have struggled, the way he, in his own privileged, ignorant way, was struggling now. He would dedicate the rest of his existence, whether it was from a jail cell or not, to honoring the life he had so carelessly, so callously destroyed. It wasn't a negotiation. It wasn't a deal. It was a vow. A sacred oath. Lena stared at him, her chest heaving, her mind reeling. The raw sincerity in his voice, the utter devastating brokenness in his eyes. It was something she couldn't immediately dismiss. The man standing before her was not the same arrogant monster who had walked in an hour ago. He was a man drowning in his own guilt, desperately reaching for a life raft. She didn't agree. She didn't forgive him. She simply said, her voice cold as ice, "Do it. And then, when there is nothing left of the man you were, you will walk into a police station, and you will confess. And I will be there to watch." It was a sentence and a reprieve, all in one. The weeks that followed were a blur of frenzied, desperate activity for Alistair. He was true to his word. He began the systematic, brutal dismantling of his empire, piece by piece. His lawyers thought he was having a psychotic break. His business partners screamed at him over the phone, calling him a traitor and a fool. He ignored them all, moving with the relentless focus of a man on a holy mission. The process was a brutal, humbling, and profound education. He met with the families who would benefit from the foundation, listened to their stories of struggle, financial ruin, and resilience, and saw in their tired, hopeful faces the echoes of Lena's pain. He learned more about humanity and compassion in those few weeks than he had in 50 years of ruthless acquisition. He didn't see Lena. Their only communication was through a shell-shocked team of lawyers, but he felt her presence in everything he did. She was the ghost at every board meeting, the silent observer at every transaction. Her son, Leo, a boy he had never met, became more real to him than most of the living people he knew. He also started spending real, quality time with Daniel. He fired the nurses, much to their surprise and his son's quiet delight. He took over Daniel's care himself. It was clumsy and frustrating at first, a slow, awkward dance of trial and error. But he learned. He learned the infinite patience required to help Daniel dress, the specific way to cut his food so he wouldn't choke, the subtle cues in his slurred speech that signaled his needs. He learned to listen. Truly listen. Not with impatience, but with a deep, abiding love that he had never before allowed himself to fully express. And in caring for his own son, in the quiet, intimate moments of daily life, he began, in some small, agonizing way, to understand the true depth of Lena's loss. Every small victory with Daniel, a shared laugh over a spilled drink, a sentence clearly spoken, a moment of shared understanding, was a painful, stabbing reminder of all the thousands of moments that had been stolen from Lena and Leo. His redemption wasn't a grand gesture. It was a slow, agonizing, and deeply personal transformation, built one small, humble, painful act at a time. He was becoming the father he should have been, not to erase his past, but to honor the boy whose future he had so selfishly taken. The day finally came when the last paper was signed, the last asset transferred. The Blackwood Empire, a titan of global finance, was no more. In its place was the Leo Miller Foundation, a multi-million-dollar charity, a permanent institution dedicated to providing advanced medical care and holistic support for children with severe physical disabilities. Alistair was left with nothing but a modest, carefully managed trust fund for Daniel's future care and the clothes on his back. He stood before a mirror in the empty, cavernous hall of his once grand mansion, the walls now bare, the floors echoing with his footsteps. The house had been sold to a tech billionaire who planned to tear it down. The man looking back at him in the dusty mirror was a stranger. The arrogance was gone, replaced by a deep, weary sadness that had settled into his bones. The sharp, predatory glint in his eyes had softened into something that looked unnervingly like humility. He looked, he thought, like a man who had finally been defeated. His lawyer had arranged the final meeting. Lena was waiting for him in a small, sterile, anonymous conference room in a downtown office building. She was there to receive the final paperwork for the foundation. And he was there to fulfill the last crucial part of his promise. He walked into the room, his heart pounding a slow, heavy rhythm against his ribs. Lena sat at the far end of a long, polished table, her back ramrod straight. She looked different, too. The raw exhaustion was still there, etched into the fine lines around her eyes, but there was a new strength in her gaze, a new, quiet sense of purpose. They didn't speak. Words were inadequate. He simply walked to the table and slid the thick folder of documents across the polished wood. She opened it, her eyes scanning the pages with a practiced, dispassionate air. For 10 long minutes, the only sound in the room was the soft, crisp rustle of paper. When she was finished, she closed the folder and placed her hands on top of it. "It's done," she said, her voice devoid of any discernible emotion. "You did what you said you would do." "Yes," Alistair replied, his voice hoarse. "Now it's time for me to finish my end of the bargain." He reached into the inner pocket of his jacket and pulled out a small, folded piece of paper. It was his written confession, detailed and damning, every word a nail in his own coffin. "I'm on my way to the police station now." He expected her to nod, to dismiss him with a cold glare, to finally let the full weight of the law fall upon him. But she didn't. She just stared at him, her expression unreadable, her gaze intense. "Before you go," she said, her voice quiet but firm, "there's something you need to see." She reached into her bag and pulled out a worn, scuffed, leather-bound photo album. She opened it and pushed it across the table toward him. The first picture was of a smiling, red-faced baby with a shock of black hair, wrapped in a blue hospital blanket. "That's Leo," she said softly. The day we brought him home from the hospital, Alistair looked at the photo, his breath catching in his throat. He turned the page with a trembling hand. Leo as a toddler, covered in mud, taking his first wobbly steps. Leo on his first day of school, his oversized backpack almost as big as he was, a nervous smile on his face, page after page of a life lived, a life full of joy, laughter, and light. And then, the pictures changed. The tone shifted. Leo in a hospital bed, his small body hooked up to a terrifying tangle of wires and tubes. Leo in a wheelchair, a faint, brave, heartbreaking smile on his face. The images were a testament to a mother's unending love and a little boy's incredible, stubborn resilience. Alistair felt the tears welling in his eyes, hot and shameful. This was the life he had destroyed. This was the vibrant, beautiful soul he had extinguished on a dark, rainy night and then forgotten about. He turned to the last page, his heart aching. He was expecting another picture of Leo, perhaps the last one ever taken. But it wasn't. It was a picture of a woman, a young, smiling woman with dark, familiar eyes and a sad, gentle smile. She was standing in front of a hospital, holding a newborn baby wrapped in a blue blanket. Alistair frowned, his mind clouded with confusion. "Who is this?" Lena took a deep, shuddering breath. "That's me," she said. "And that's Leo." She pointed to a man standing beside her in the photo, his arm wrapped tightly around her shoulders, a proud, beaming, exhausted smile on his face. He was a young man, handsome and kind-eyed, dressed in a doctor's scrubs. "And that," she said, her voice breaking on the last word, "is my husband, Dr. David Miller. He was a pediatric surgeon at the city hospital." Alistair stared at the photo, a cold, sickening dread creeping up his spine, a feeling far worse than the fear of prison. He didn't understand. "The night of the accident," Lena continued, her voice a raw, ragged whisper that seemed to be torn from her very soul. David was on his way home from a 24-hour shift. He had just performed a life-saving 8-hour surgery on a little girl. He was a hero. But he was tired. So tired. He fell asleep at the wheel. He drifted into the oncoming lane. The world seemed to tilt and spin, the floor dropping out from under him. Alistair looked up from the photo, his eyes wide with a wild, desperate disbelief. "What are you saying?" "The black sedan," Lena said, the tears now streaming down her face, a silent, steady cascade of grief. "The car my son was in. It wasn't you who hit him, Alistair. It was him who hit you." The confession, the one he had clutched in his hand like a key to his own damnation, felt like a lead weight. The memory of that night, so vivid and terrifying, was a lie. A story he had told himself to make sense of the chaos, the jolt, the thud. It had been the other car, the one that had swerved without warning into his path. He hadn't been a drunken hit-and-run driver. He had been a victim. He had panicked, yes. He had run, yes. A coward's act. But he wasn't a killer. "The police report," he stammered, his mind racing, trying to rearrange the pieces of his shattered reality. They said it was a hit-and-run because you drove away," Lena said, her voice filled with a grief that spanned a decade. "They found my husband's car. They found my son. But they never found the other driver. I've spent all these years hating a phantom, a faceless, wealthy monster in a black sedan. I never knew. Until that day in the diner, when you told me about the car, I never knew it was you." The revelation was a final, devastating twist of the knife. His guilt, the very engine that had driven his painful, arduous transformation, was a phantom of his own making. The entire foundation of his redemption was built on a terrible, tragic, and profound misunderstanding. He hadn't destroyed her life. Their lives had simply, horrifically collided, two ships lost in a storm, leaving a wreckage that had defined them both for a decade. He looked at Lena, at the woman he thought he had wronged so terribly, and saw not an accuser, but a fellow survivor, trapped in the same tragic story. And in her eyes, he saw not hatred, but a deep, shared, and inconsolable sorrow. The silence in the conference room was profound, a sacred space heavy with the weight of two lives irrevocably altered by a single, tragic moment on a dark highway. Alistair looked at the confession in his hand, the paper now seeming flimsy and meaningless, the ink a testament to a fiction he had constructed out of fear and shame. He had been so ready, so willing, to accept his punishment, to pay for a crime he hadn't committed. The guilt had been a shield, a way to make sense of the senseless, to give his son's own tragedy a dark, karmic meaning. "Why?" he finally managed to ask, his voice a hoarse whisper that was barely audible in the quiet room. "Why let me do all this? Why let me believe I was a monster?" Lena took a long time to answer. She traced the edge of the photo album with her finger, her gaze distant, lost in the landscape of her own painful memories. "Because at first," she said, her voice low and honest, "I wanted you to suffer. When you confessed in the diner, I felt a satisfaction so dark and venomous it scared me. It felt like justice. I wanted you to feel even a fraction of the pain I've felt every single day for the past 10 years. I wanted you to tear down your life, just as mine was torn down in an instant." She looked up, and her eyes, cleared now of hatred, met his. "But then, I started to see the reports from the Foundation's lawyers. I read the letters from the families you were helping, families on the brink of collapse. I saw the pictures of children who were getting a chance at a life, a chance at some small joy, a life my Leo never had. And I saw you, in the background of a photo from a charity event, helping Daniel out of his chair. You looked different. The man in that photo wasn't a monster. He was just a father, a tired, sad, but dedicated father." She pushed the photo album back into her bag, closing a chapter of her life. "My husband was a good man," she continued, her voice soft but firm, a quiet eulogy. "He made a mistake, a terrible, fatal mistake, and he paid for it with his life. I've spent a decade drowning in grief and anger, looking for someone to blame. It was easier to hate a faceless villain than to accept the random, cruel meaninglessness of it all. But blame doesn't heal. It just poisons. It poisons everything." Alistair felt the carefully constructed walls of his own narrative crumble to dust. His guilt, his redemption, it had all been a story he told himself. The truth was messier, more complicated, and infinitely more tragic. There were no villains in this story, only victims. "What you did," Lena said, her voice gaining a new, hard-won clarity, "was born from a lie you told yourself. But the good that came from it, that's real. The children who will be helped by Leo's foundation, their lives will be better because of what you did. You may have started this journey for the wrong reasons, Alistair, but you became a different man along the way. Maybe that's the only kind of redemption that matters." She stood up, her movements graceful and resolute. "I can't forgive you. Not for driving away. Not for leaving my husband and my son on the side of that road. That is a truth you have to live with for the rest of your life. And I don't know if I can ever forgive myself for the years I spent letting hatred consume me. But maybe we can stop punishing each other. And ourselves." She walked to the door, then paused, her hand on the handle. "What will you do now?" Alistair looked at his hands, no longer the hands of a titan of industry that signed billion-dollar deals, but the hands of a man who had learned to patiently button his son's shirt. He thought of the long, quiet evenings he now spent with Daniel, not filling the silence with the noise of television, but with conversation, with reading, with simply being present. "I'm going to be a father," he said, the words feeling more real and substantial than any title or accolade he had ever held. "I'm going to take my son fishing. He's always wanted to go fishing." A faint, sad, but genuine smile touched Lena's lips. It was the first time he had seen her smile without the heavy shadow of grief behind it. "Leo loved fishing," she said softly, and then she was gone. Alistair didn't go to the police station. His confession was a lie, and a true one would only heap more pain onto Lena's life, tarnishing the memory of the husband she had loved. His penance would not be a jail cell. It would be a life of quiet service, of honoring the memory of a boy he never knew by cherishing the son he had almost lost in his own pride and fear. He walked out of the office building and into the bright afternoon sun, feeling lighter than he had in years. The crushing weight of his phantom guilt was gone, replaced by a profound, aching sorrow, but also by a fragile, tentative hope. He hadn't earned forgiveness. He hadn't found absolution. But he had stumbled, blindly and accidentally, into something far more valuable. He had found his own humanity. Months later, on a still, misty morning, a small boat drifted on the placid surface of a quiet lake. Alistair watched as Daniel, with a new, powered reel he had designed for him, expertly cast a line into the water. The boy's face, usually a mask of frustration, was calm and focused, lit with a quiet joy. He looked over at his father and smiled, a wide, clear, unambiguous smile. Alistair smiled back. It was a simple image, a world away from the life of power and prestige he had once craved. But for the first time, it felt like enough. It felt like everything. The road ahead was long, and the past would always be a passenger, a quiet ghost in the back seat. But it was no longer his destination. It was just the place he had started from.